researchers believe they've located the leading cause of death when it comes to mummies.
Somewhere beneath the Sahara Desert, buried under 1 billion tons of sand, an entire branch of the human family tree has been hiding. Not for centuries, not for millennia, for 50,000 years, and nobody knew they were there. In 2003, a team of archaeologists crawled into a rock shelter in southwestern Libya and began scraping at the ground. On the second day, a jawbone emerged from the sand, then skin, then ligaments, then tissue. A naturally mummified woman, 7,000 years old, perfectly preserved in a landscape where absolutely nothing is supposed to survive. The Sahara destroys everything. Bones crumble. Organic material disintegrates. DNA shatters into molecular dust under the relentless cycle of scorching days and freezing nights. Every previous attempt to pull a usable genome from remains found in conditions like these had ended in failure. Every lab, every technique, every team, all of them came up empty. But a group of geneticists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology decided to try anyway. And when they finally cracked the genetic code locked inside this ancient woman's bones, they didn't just fill in a blank chapter of human history. They exposed a chapter nobody knew existed, because her DNA didn't match any known population on the planet. Not one. And the deeper the researchers looked, the stranger the story became, until it reached all the way back to the very first moment our species stepped beyond the borders of Africa, 50 millennia ago. What they uncovered is about to rearrange everything you think you know about where we came from. The Takarkori rock shelter sits in Libya's Takarkori Mountains, a region that today looks like it belongs on another planet. Barren rock, endless dunes, temperatures that can swing 40 degrees between noon and midnight. Nothing green, nothing alive. Nothing, for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, that suggests this place ever supported a single living thing. But 7,000 years ago, you wouldn't recognize it. Geologists call the era between roughly 14,500 and 5,000 years ago the African humid period. A wobble in Earth's orbital axis supercharged the West African monsoon, pushing rain deep into the continental interior. The entire Sahara transformed into a lush savanna. Permanent lakes appeared. Rivers carved new paths. Lake Chad alone swelled to a body of water the size of modern Germany. Hippos wallowed in the shallows. Elephants grazed the grasslands. Crocodiles lined the riverbanks. And people were everywhere. Rock paintings from this era show scenes of astonishing complexity. Hunters pursuing giraffes, families at waterholes, cattle swimming through rivers. These weren't desperate survivors. These were thriving communities, settled and organized, generation after generation. At Takarkori, the evidence was unmistakable. 15 individuals, mostly women and children, had been buried inside the shelter across 4,000 years of continuous occupation. The site contained pottery with milk fat residues, the oldest evidence of dairying on the African continent, and traces of early cereal domestication. This wasn't a campsite. This was home. And the desert had sealed it like a vault. 2 of those women never decomposed. The dry desert air mummified them naturally, preserving skin, ligaments, and soft tissue. Archaeologist Savino di Lernia, who led the excavation for Sapienza University of Rome, recalled the moment his team found the first remains. They scratched the sand and there was the jawbone. Both women had died around 5000 BCE, right as the climate began to shift. They were in their 40s, and locked inside their preserved tissues was genetic material that would take 2 more decades to decode. When it was finally read, the results detonated beneath the entire field of population genetics. Here's what makes this discovery almost absurd. Ancient DNA and extreme heat are fundamentally incompatible. The Sahara's temperature swings shatter genetic material at the molecular level, snapping strands into fragments too tiny to sequence. For decades, the scientific consensus was absolute. You cannot recover whole genomes from hot desert mummies. Not difficult, impossible. Paleogeneticist Nada Salem at the Max Planck Institute refused to accept that verdict. Her team targeted the teeth and petrous bones, where DNA survives longest, shielded inside mineralized tissue. They applied the most advanced sequencing technology available, rebuilding the genetic code fragment by fragment from material the desert had spent 7 millennia trying to destroy. Both genomes came back complete. Johannes Krause, the study's senior author and director at the Max Planck Institute, described the achievement as remarkable. These are among the oldest mummies on Earth from which whole genomes have been recovered. But the real shock was waiting inside the data. When the team compared those genomes against hundreds of modern and ancient DNA samples from across Africa, Europe, and southwestern Asia, the results defied every expectation. The expectation was straightforward. During the African humid period, the Sahara was a continuous green corridor with no barriers blocking movement. Populations should have been mixing freely across thousands of kilometers of fertile savanna. These women, logically, should carry genetic signatures consistent with sub-Saharan African populations. They carried none. 0 sub-Saharan African ancestry. During the greenest, most connected era the Sahara had experienced in tens of thousands of years, these women's ancestors maintained total genetic separation from the populations living just south of them. In a landscape with no walls, their lineage behaved as though surrounded by them. The Green Sahara, which scientists long assumed was a migration highway, apparently wasn't one for this group. Knowledge moved through it. Genes did not. But that wasn't the strangest part. Their closest genetic relatives weren't nearby populations at all. They were 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers buried in Tafaralt Cave in Morocco, people who predated the African humid period entirely. Two populations separated by 8 millennia and hundreds of kilometers shared a deep genetic signature found nowhere else on Earth. Not in Europe, not in the Near East, not in sub-Saharan Africa, nowhere. Both groups trace their origins to an ancient North African lineage that had persisted along the northern rim of the continent for tens of thousands of years, invisible to every prior study, silent in every data set. An entire branch of the human family tree that science had walked past for decades without ever knowing it was there. The team pushed deeper. They compared the Takarkori genomes against some of the oldest known modern humans identified outside Africa, including individuals from roughly 50,000 years ago. The Takarkori women were more closely related to those ancient out-of-Africa migrants than to any sub-Saharan African population alive today. Let that register. These Libyan shepherdesses, buried 7,000 years ago, carried DNA connecting them directly to the first wave of Homo sapiens to leave Africa 50,000 years earlier. Their ancestors were part of, or closely linked to, that original migration, and then remained in North Africa, genetically unchanged, for an almost inconceivable span of time. To grasp the scale, all of recorded human history fits inside the last 5,000 years. That's 1/10 of how long this population remained genetically isolated. While the rest of humanity spread across continents, built civilizations, mixed and merged in every direction. This lineage persisted in the same corner of the world. Ice ages came and went. Sea levels rose 100 meters and fell again. The woolly mammoth appeared and went extinct, and this group endured, unmixed, untouched. For years, population geneticists had noticed faint anomalies in the DNA of modern North Africans, traces of an unknown ancestral group that didn't match any documented population, living or dead. The signals were too faint to prove anything but too consistent to dismiss. Researchers called it a ghost population, a human group whose existence could only be inferred from echoes in living people's genomes. Suspected, theorized, never proven, until the sands of Takarkori gave up their dead, and the ghost finally got a face. The implications went beyond ancestry charts. The Takarkori women were pastoralists. They herded sheep, goats, and cattle. They made pottery. They maintained a functioning agricultural community inside the Green Sahara at precisely the moment when farming and animal domestication were transforming human civilization across the ancient world. For decades, the dominant model held that pastoralism spread from the Near East through physical migration. Farmers and herders carried their animals into new territories, absorbing or replacing local populations. Migration equaled civilization. People carried ideas in their genes. The Takarkori genomes destroyed that model. These women's DNA contained no Near Eastern ancestry, no Levantine signatures, no Anatolian farmer lineage, not a single genetic marker the conventional model required. Yet they were herding, clearly and definitively, for thousands of years, with animals whose wild ancestors came from the other side of the Mediterranean. And here's the twist. They had pottery resembling styles from sub-Saharan Africa and cultural connections to the Nile Valley. They were plugged into a continental network of ideas, technologies, and trade spanning thousands of kilometers. They just weren't plugged into anyone else's gene pool. Dilernia put it plainly. They were isolated genetically but deeply connected culturally. Knowledge flowed freely across that green landscape. Genes did not. Ideas crossed every boundary. DNA crossed none. For thousands of years, at the crossroads of the ancient world, this community absorbed technologies from every passing civilization while maintaining total genetic separation. Krauss described them as something like living fossils, clinging to their ancestral roots until the Sahara dried up around them. Then came the detail that pushed the timeline back even further than anyone anticipated. The mummies carried Neanderthal DNA, not much, roughly 0.15% of their total genome, which is about 10 times less than what people living outside sub-Saharan Africa carry today. Most sub-Saharan Africans carry almost none, since Neanderthals lived exclusively in Eurasia. The Takarkori women occupied a strange, narrow space in between. That tiny fraction is a molecular timestamp. It dates to one event. When the ancestors of these women encountered Neanderthals during the first wave of human migration out of Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago. They picked up a faint genetic trace during that initial contact, and then carried it unchanged for 50 millennia, never accumulating more, never mixing again. A snapshot frozen in their cells like an insect in amber. While every other population that left Africa went on to interbreed with Neanderthals repeatedly, accumulating higher percentages of archaic DNA over millennia, this lineage sealed itself off. One encounter, one trace. 50,000 years of silence. The Takarkori people didn't perish in war or conquest. They were erased by the planet itself. Over centuries, the African humid period gave way to aridification. Rains retreated. Lakes shrank and cracked into lifeless earth. Grasslands browned. Rivers went dry. The world their ancestors had known for 50,000 years vanished in slow motion. As habitable zones contracted, the genetic boundaries that had defined this population became impossible to maintain. They were absorbed into the broader North African populations they had traded with but never merged with, leaving faint genetic traces in modern North Africans, and 2 mummified women in a Libyan rock shelter, waiting 7,000 years for someone to listen. The Sahara stretches across more than 9 million square kilometers, larger than the continental United States. Thousands of unexplored rock shelters from an era when this landscape was the most fertile on Earth remain untouched. As sequencing technology improves and archaeology pushes deeper into Libya, Algeria, Chad, and Niger, the ghost population of Takarkori may be only the first lost lineage to surface. Mary Prendergast, an anthropologist at Rice University, who wrote an accompanying commentary for Nature, noted that research is only beginning to reveal Africa's complex population history, and even small samples can reshape our understanding. 2 women, 2 genomes, and they proved that an entire branch of humanity survived for 50,000 years in total genetic isolation, while borrowing knowledge from every civilization around them. They proved ideas can spread without migration. They proved human populations can remain genetically frozen across timescales that dwarf all of recorded history. And they proved that what we know about our own ancestry is only what the sand has chosen to give back so far. The next mummy is out there right now, buried, preserved, carrying a genome no one alive has ever seen, waiting in the dark for someone to scratch the surface. And based on what Takarkori has already revealed, whatever emerges next could make this discovery look like just the opening chapter. If this rewired the way you see human history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. What do you think is still buried beneath the Sahara? And if you're not subscribed yet, fix that right now. Because what that desert is hiding, we're going to find. And you're going to want to be here when we do.